This is Keys to the Shop's Rate of Rise series. Today we're talking about how to avoid tipping with roasting consultant and author Rob House. Well, hey everyone, and welcome to Keys to the Shop's Rate of Rise series. This is a series designed to have elevated conversations on roasting. We dive deep into subjects concerning roasters and roasteries, the business of roasting, the craft and science, etc. There's so much to cover. And we've been doing this for the past year. I'm excited for this coming year. This is our first episode of 2023, and we have such a great guest today to talk about a very important subject. Now, this episode is brought to you by Roast Magazine, who is one of the longest running and most respected trade journals in the coffee industry. Roast Magazine presents articles and content featuring the latest research, knowledge, and insights from scientists, subject matter experts, and professionals from across the industry. This means Roast Magazine is the best source to get in-depth explanations on the art, science, and craft of roasting and the business of roasting. Go visit them over at roastmagazine.com and get subscribed today. Roast Magazine also has published many books on roasting, green coffee, and more. You can check it all out when you go to their website, again, over at roastmagazine.com. Okay, everyone, well, today we are going to be talking with a returning guest, a longtime coffee friend of mine, Rob House. Rob House is a coffee roasting consultant and owner of House Coffee Consulting and Iteration Coffee. Rob is the author of Modulating the Flavor Profile of Coffee and has been a roaster since 2008. He has extensive experience in the specialty coffee industry, including roasting, training, purchasing, and profile evaluation. He is a subject matter expert for the Specialty Coffee Association and conducts coffee roasting workshops online and in person at his lab in Rainier, Oregon. And most recently, Rob has written a booklet that you can find on his website. It's all about the defect of tipping, what this is all about, what causes it, and how to avoid it. And this is exactly the kind of subject that we want to, feature on these Rate of Rise episodes. And so Rob is back to talk all about this. So in this episode, we get to explore what is tipping, where does it come from, is it partial to particular types of coffee or processes and that kind of thing. And then as we discuss the intricacies of tipping, we also talk about very practical ways that you can avoid tipping to a degree that it does not impact your coffee flavor. And so that is something we all want. We're always trying to pursue better roasts, and Rob is here to help us. So I'm excited to have him on the show again, and I hope you get a lot out of this conversation. So without anything else from me, let's get right to it. Here now is my conversation on tipping with Rob House. Well, Rob, welcome to Keys to the Shop again. Glad to have you back on the show.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, what has it been? It's probably 5 years since you've been on the show. I feel like you were on the show, if I'm recalling correctly, within the first year of Keys to the Shop.
That's possible. The time is kind of moving way too fast and awkwardly these days, so I don't really know how long ago it was.
Right. That was, people can find that in the show notes, What Your Roaster Wants You to Know with Rob House. And so now you're in your own facility, doing all the training and consulting. Tell us a little bit about what you've been up to lately.
Yeah, I guess so. My family and I moved to Rainier, Oregon, and we converted a detached 2-car garage into a roasting lab space. So we're fully Department of Agriculture certified space for roasting, and I've got a number of roasting machines here and have been inviting people from all over the world to come and learn coffee roasting with me here. It's also the home base for the Iteration Coffee project, where I take a new coffee, every month or every couple months, and basically do product development on it the way that I would do for myself if I was running a coffee roasting business, and then share all the data and notes, have a chat, and send out the coffee for people to taste. So it's a lot of fun.
That sounds awesome. And obviously a lot of people know you from your book, Modulating the Flavor Profile of Coffee, and you've continued to write about coffee and be a super active participant in roasting education over the years. And so today, what I wanted to talk about with you is the latest thing that I've seen kind of blow up on the internet that you've put out there, and it's all about tipping, something that I think, I've heard people talk about a lot throughout my career, and it's just kind of an accepted part of roasting for a lot of people. But as you say in the article in this piece, that it's one of the most identifiable defects in coffee, and it doesn't seem to be, at least from my perspective, one of those things that people are as obsessed about as maybe they should be. I don't know. But let's start from the beginning and talk a little bit about, one, like, what is tipping and why did you feel the need right now to kind of focus in on it the way you did?
Yeah, absolutely. So tipping is a roasting defect. It's one of the objective roasting defects. And so I guess you could break them apart into two segments, the objective and the subjective roasting defects. I love objective roasting defects because they're either there or they are not there. And there's no kind of weirdness. The subjective ones, like over and underdeveloped, over and under roasted and baked, those are very much in the eye of the beholder. Somebody's underdeveloped might be someone else's overdeveloped. So it's really very dependent there, which is why they're so subjective. The objective ones, there's usually some sort of physical indicator that shows that you've had that problem. And so it's really easy to identify. It's very straightforward, which makes it really nice because it's not up to the opinion mill sort of thing. Tipping is one of those objective defects. And what happens with tipping is that the area that the coffee is being roasted by gets so hot that the endosperm cap, which is the part of the bean that's covering where the germ lives in the seed, which is only on the one side, gets charred. And so when you have the tipping defect, you'll notice a black spot on one of the ends or one of the tips of the coffee seed. And that's probably part of why it got the name of tipping.
Right. So that's interesting. I think that it feels like kind of a hard thing to like chase down in your roasting. It feels like that the way you described it, that seems like a different part of the bean that needs to be treated more delicately, or at least it seems like pretty tricky to try to manage, not, like, for lack of a better term, overcooking this little piece of one bean in the process of roasting. Is tipping something that people typically accept as just a part of the roasting process and don't really address it as much?
I think it's a mixed bag. I think that a lot of the roasters that I've worked with over the years, consulting wise, do work to try and avoid tipping, and they're cognizant of it. I know that in my own former advice, I would suggest that there are some coffees that just tipped. And I would say, well, some coffees just tip. That's how it is. And you have to either roast in such a way that minimizes its impact on the flavor, but it's still present. Or, if you work your profile to the point where you get tipping to go away, the roast might actually taste worse than if some minor tipping was present. And kind of like this whole live with it idea. So I think that there's a mix. I think most people that I've worked with are somewhat aware of it, at least. And especially people that are working with lower altitude grown coffee, like Brazil's, for example, from Cerrado. They're savvy to the fact that it's there. The question is, are they able to take the steps to mitigate it or not? And if they can't figure out how to mitigate it, can they get it to the point where it's at least livable?
Well, I think there's one thing that I want to kind of dig into a little bit deeper, because we're going to talk about mitigation of these things. But you mentioned like a certain origin of coffee that might be more predisposed to tipping. What's the breakdown there? What are there particular origins that are more predisposed to it, as you've kind of just described? How do you know ahead of time? Is it just the way the bean is shaped, the composition? Does it have something to do with the cultivation of that particular coffee? What's behind that?
Yeah, I mean, at this point in time, the biggest correlation that I've seen is with altitude of growth. And so in the past, I would have also associated it with density, because usually lower altitude coffee is less dense, or so the saying goes. And so I'd say, oh, well, lower altitude coffee is less dense. And because it's less dense, this soft spot is even softer. And so that's going to cause it to be more susceptible to charring. And that doesn't seem to be the case because low altitude coffee isn't necessarily less dense. Low altitude coffee grown in very specific climate conditions can have a slow maturation rate and can actually be quite dense. So density doesn't seem to be playing a role in whether or not tipping happens. Rather, the altitude of growth does. And as I kind of list out in the publication, there's a couple different reasons why that could be true. But the reality is that I don't know why it's true yet. And that would take somebody whose scientific leaning is definitely more oriented towards plant botany and those sorts of things to kind of elucidate what's actually going on.
So now, we have this kind of mystery. Now, some origins that are higher altitude produce a little bit more predisposition toward tipping. So we can kind of look for that. It feels like there's a couple of stages of how you could look for this. So visually, of course, as you've seen, if you've read this on your website, this article, there's examples of what tipping looks like, which might be hard to pull out if you're working with coffee that has some modeling on it, like different darker brown areas, different origins might make it more difficult to identify tipping. But when you're identifying it, is it just something that you have to go through every batch to examine whether it's happened visually?
Well, it kind of yes and no. So I know that this might be more of an old school mentality, but I think it's beneficial. People don't pull their triers near as much as they used to. And I don't want to sound like an old fogey because I'm not. I'm like 37. But
totally young.
It's important to look at your coffee when you're roasting because your thermocouple can only tell you so much. And the amount of time that you have your fryer out isn't really going to impact the roasting of the coffee to be able to look at it. So tipping is something that I think is actually fairly easy to notice, especially when you're pulling your trier during the beginning stages of the roast. So, for me, I'm not just kind of putting them in, leaving them until first crack and only smelling around there, or just doing it for the photo ops for, the marketing department of whatever roastery I'm working with. Pulling the trier is really about paying attention to the coffee as it goes through all the stages. And so when you're first approaching a coffee or when you're doing product development and design on a coffee, I think it's really important to be pulling the trier frequently, all the way from green through till the end of the roast, because you need to get a feel for what the coffee's doing. And so paying attention to tipping in the trier is usually the way that I spot it is there. And it can happen as early as green. You'll start to notice discolorations where the endosperm cap is turning white ahead of the rest of the coffee. And then in yellowing, the endosperm cap is starting to brown ahead of the rest of the coffee. And then when you get to browning, it's starting to blacken ahead of the rest of the coffee. And so you can see it kind of go through this progression during the roast, and you can be savvy to the fact that it's there. And the question, too, isn't like, can we perfectly eliminate tipping all the way? It's really a question of thresholds for how much tipping is going to actually impact the flavor profile of the coffee versus not. And then, too, just as a quick side note sort of thing, Quakers just tip. And so if you have a Quaker or an unripe coffee seed in there that's going to come out at the end of the day a much lighter color brown than the rest of the seeds, it will have tipping, almost guaranteed. So I don't really count those when I'm thinking about tipping overall. I'm thinking about the good quality coffee seeds that have come through the batch and whether or not they have tipping present.
Okay, so you mentioned the impact on flavor and what the acceptable range of impact is, not whether or not we can, eliminate this 100%. So explain a little bit about the flavor impact of tipping, both on the extreme end of, disrupting the flavor and on the acceptable end of, it's okay, let's just let it go.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that it brings to the flavor profile is a bit of a burnt aftertaste. And so everything about the coffee tastes fine, except there's this burnt, bitter aftertaste present in the coffee. And that can even show up as a burnt, bitter foretaste as well, and not just an aftertaste, depending on how severe it is. So it's like, is it in the foretaste, like when you're initially tasting the coffee? Is it just in the aftertaste? Or can you not really pick up on a burnt characteristic at all? Obviously, this could make it much harder to detect and care about in significantly darker roast levels. But when you're talking about light roasting, it's like, oh, all the flavors are pleasant. Everything's there that I want to have there. And then there's this burnt aftertaste. That's usually what I pick up on. And sometimes when I'm working with clients, I don't even necessarily look physically at the coffee first. But if I notice a burnt aftertaste, the first thing I'll look for is tipping on the finished coffee, or facing, but that's outside of the scope of what we're talking about here. But I'll look for tipping the moment I start tasting that burnt aftertaste. And then if there is tipping, well, that's something that we can work on mitigating. If there's not tipping, there's a burnt aftertaste, then I'm starting to think about facing or scorching. And if I can't see facing, then scorching, which tends to hide itself by the end of the roast, is more than likely the issue.
So when you're roasting coffee, and you said that when you're doing darker roasts, it can mask these defects, this tipping defect, and maybe other defects as well, similar to what you were just talking about. But it seems to me that if you're not looking for this the way you were describing with a trier, right? You're not looking for it in all of your coffees, then once you do come around to doing a light roast, your protocols for roasting are just going to accept this as a more likely outcome because you're just not looking for it in the darker coffees. But so it's harder to switch into being more vigilant in the lighter roast, I suppose.
Yeah, and of course, all these words, I mean, I don't know if I can reference this show on your show, but whose line is it anyway, right? Like in coffee, everything's made up and the words don't matter. So what is a dark roast, I guess, is the first question. You know, if you're roasting to like well past second crack, like 470, 480, 490, then yeah, I mean, it's going to be really hard to notice any other burnt flavors because the whole bean is effectively charring to a certain degree. I'm not saying that's a bad way to roast, just saying that at that point, a lot of the flavor profiles kind of move that way anyway. When we think about like how a lot of third wavers, or I don't know if third waver is even the appropriate term anymore, we'll say modern trendy coffee roasters.
I like third wavers.
You like third wavers better? I like calling it modern trendy because it's like, I don't even know what we're doing nowadays, guys. But, you know, at a certain point, it's like, I'm working with clients now who have never roasted to second crack. And like, I make the joke that we'll all just hold hands and take a batch to second crack together. But, you know, that was unheard of when I started roasting, and probably, Chris, even for you in the game, like for people who have not roasted to second crack,
right?
Like ever. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of just a funny thing. So for me, dark roast starts at second crack. So like a dark roast is something that goes to second crack. And then beyond that, it goes darker, you know, carbon effectively. So if you're on the trendy third wave, new age coffee roaster side of things, you might notice tipping in your dark roast because they're not, frankly, all that dark. Sure. And so it brings in this roasty characteristic that you find unpleasant because it's more roasty or more smoky than what you're actually aiming for a coffee.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. Now, if I am doing what you suggested and using my trier a lot, and I see this, no matter what the roast is that I'm doing, I see it forming, in my mind, it seems like, man, well, it's too late. I can't do anything about it. Or can I? Is there something you do where you just say, nope, let's ride it. Let's do what we're supposed to do with this coffee and then adjust it in the next batch?
Yeah, well, since you're doing product development, usually in these stages, because I would say like once you figure out how to make your roast taste amazing, then it should just all be about production. And unless there's some significant changes to, in particular, the airflow in your system, tipping just shouldn't start happening suddenly. So during the product development, you could go either way. You could say, well, let's try and save the batch. And you know, the way to do that would be by reducing your air temperatures pretty significantly. Or you could plan for your next batch to kind of have that taken into account, because, you know, by reducing the air temperature, you're going to be reducing your roasting speed more than likely. And if you haven't planned for that, it's just going to elongate your roast. So if you're okay with a longer roast for that coffee, then that's fine. Otherwise, it's kind of back to the drawing board once you restart. And that could go one of two ways. Maybe that means you're lowering your batch size so you can use cooler air to roast less coffee more quickly. Could be playing with your airflow to set up your system so that you're able to roast quickly but not have the airflow be as hot, which is a fun trick that we talk about in the publication. Something along those lines is probably what you're going to be aiming to do. And you could theoretically stop the impact of what the flavor profile is going to be in the current roast that you're doing. But that's also, like I said, probably going to elongate the roast and cause some different flavor outcomes anyway.
How does lowering your batch size impact air temperature, allowing you to use cooler air?
Oh, it's just that you don't have to push as much heat into the system to get a smaller amount of coffee to roast at the same speed. And so if you're roasting a smaller batch, typically you're using less burner, which results in lower temperature air to roast at the same speed as you would a much larger batch.
Are you finding that people are simply wanting to max out their roasters as much as possible to make more efficient use of their time roasting?
It depends. Usually for special coffees, no, because frankly, none of us can sell special coffees really quickly like that. But if you think about like people that are churning some amazing Brazil, espressos out, they're wanting to pump that at full volume or as much as they can to aid with production. And so because of that, I think some of the lower altitude coffees that are often used in blends or in darker roasts probably do see some tipping as a result of people just trying to push as much as they can through the machine. Whereas with smaller roasts, because they're special coffees or unique or what have you, kind of like the Galapagos that I roasted, you could probably do it at a lot smaller batch sizes because your demand weekly or daily is not nearly as high.
You said smaller coffees, like less in demand or physically smaller?
Oh, sorry, less in demand. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Yeah. So the days that are just like espresso days, house blend days that a lot of roasters have, where all day Wednesday, it's all about the espresso blend. These are times where circumstantially you might say, hey, let's turn up to, level orange, alert for tipping today because we're going to be maxing out the roaster.
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely think of it that way. And in my experience too, once you get to a certain size of roaster, you're churning out your blends and your espressos and your dark roasts every day because the volume is just so high. So like every day is orange, right? When you're doing those. So I would definitely suggest that when you're approaching a coffee that's grown at lower altitude and you're trying to push a full batch, it's best to be mindful of what you're doing and really keep an eye on your dryer. Although, like I said earlier, I would suggest using your dryer regularly with all of your coffees anyway. But
yeah, you might want to hire a photographer too while you do that. Nothing
is more pretentious or more of a lie than a picture of a roaster just like lost in the smell of his dryer, because as anybody who's production roasted knows, it's production. There's nothing really romantic about it at a certain point.
I love it. When we're talking about defects and how this impacts the flavor, it got me thinking that is there any other defect that's a non-objective defect that tipping masquerades as, where you could be thrown off the scent or the taste, as it were, by, this is caused by tipping, but you're actually attributing it to something that it's not?
Yeah, I guess it would probably easily masquerade as over roasted. The problem being that in our industry, most people use the term overdeveloped instead of differentiating between overdeveloped versus over roasted, which I think that the two need differentiated, because overdeveloped is simply you've taken the development time longer than is desired. Once again, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It depends on who's just desiring something out of it. But that would usually indicate like a flat coffee profile or something that has lower acidity or is less sparkly or interesting. Whereas over roasted means that your development time might be fine, the acidity, all that might be fine, but you've accidentally gone too dark. And so you have roast characteristics or undesirably roasty characteristics coming in with an otherwise fine coffee. So that would be over roasted, meaning, I'm not critiquing your development time. I'm just saying your end temperature was too high, your end color was too dark. And so I think tipping could probably easily come across as over roasted because you get that slight roasty, smoky flavor from the tipping, and that could throw things off there.
Right. And then what you do is you would adjust the wrong things and still have tipping, and then maybe have a worse coffee.
Yeah, you could very potentially end up with a under roasted coffee that still has tipping, which would be sad, because then it'd be like grainy, veggie, metallic, grassy, and also still roasty.
Now, you mentioned that the tipping happens, you can start to see it in the beginning, but in the article, you talk about how it can happen at any time in the roast. So if it's happening in the beginning, we accept that. How does that end up happening at the end?
Kind of the same sort of thing, just your air temperatures have gotten or climbed too high. With a lot of people, they tend to roast and their air temperatures tend to get to a maximum somewhere near or around first crack. And if you're roasting darker, you might actually push your air temperatures even higher toward the end of the roast. So it's very possible that you could bring your air temperatures up so hot that you actually cause damage to the coffee that way.
In the case where you might be finding tipping happening at the end because you've been pulling your dryer out more, and that's how you would probably figure that part out, you could potentially do something mid-roast to avoid that by, adjusting your air temperature.
Yeah. And when we say adjusting air temperature too, I want to make sure I'm clear. There are a couple ways to do that. You can do that by adjusting the air speed or your burner setting or both. And so for folks on drum roasters, we don't have an air temperature like you do on, say, an Akawa or something like that, where it's, I'm setting my inlet air temperature or setting my exhaust temperature. But when you're roasting on a drum roaster, you have a couple different, bells and whistles you can utilize to change the temperature of the airflow coming in the back of the roaster, which is what we're specifically concerned about, which is inlet air temp.
Okay, so when we're doing our roasting on a sample roaster, and people are, I think, and we've talked about this in term on the show before, at least in the Rate of Rise series, where, there's some translation to be done between what you've done in sample roasting and then creating an actual larger batch recipe, so to speak. So if things are turning out fine in sampling and coming up with a good profile for cupping a coffee off a small sample roaster, I guess we can't just hold that as, well, there was no tipping in the sample roaster. There might be in the larger one, especially because of the size of the batch. So we should just assume that, it's likely it's not gonna show up in the sample roaster. It's gonna show up in the larger roaster.
Yeah, and it can definitely show up in both too. And that's where you have to be careful, I think. The SCA has guidelines about no roasting defects present on your sample roast, and I've seen tipping show up for sure on sample roasts before. So it just depends on how you drive the sample roaster, right? Or how you drive the production roaster, because it's a heat transfer related defect. So it can come up both ways.
So it could maybe give you some clues as to what you might expect going into a larger volume.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. If you're seeing tipping on the sample roaster, you're probably more than likely going to see tipping on the big roaster as well.
Okay.
And if the tipping is distracting on the sample roaster, then it's probably going to be distracting on the big roaster.
One thing that I don't think we've talked about is the idea that coffee being held in storage changes moisture. And I'm curious about how moisture plays into tipping and storage, and how storage might affect the either the lack of or the presence of tipping in a coffee.
Yeah, and this is where we go into total theoretical mode. And part of it is that part of me putting out the book on tipping, or the booklet, I guess you will, because it's half the size of Modulating, is really just to also throw some ideas out at the scientific community and see if anybody wants to pick up on it and actually explore it. It seems like from the literature that I've read, the peer-reviewed scientific journals that I've gotten my hands on, concerning studies of coffee botany and particularly coffee seed botany, that which might not be the right term. Once again, not a scientist. Studied liberal arts. There you go. But the couple options that there are is, one, the germ seems to steal moisture from the endosperm cap to kind of get the germination process started. So that would be one thing worth investigating is the endosperm cap slightly drier than the rest of the seed on coffees that are tipping? And that would make sense. Moisture acts as a barrier for heat transfer. And so if you don't have that barrier present, if the endosperm cap is slightly drier than the rest of the seed, then you would have tipping, and that makes total sense. The other option is the germ starts to chemically degrade the endosperm cap so that it's weaker, so that the germ can push through and start growing a root system for the tiny little coffee plant. And so it's also possible that the germ has weakened the structure of the coffee seed where the endosperm cap is, and that's causing the tipping to happen. Or it could be both. So it could be that it's drier and that it's structurally weakened. All of those are really interesting theories that I have no way of testing. But there's something about the makeup of the endosperm cap. So then the question is, okay, well, why altitude? Are coffees grown at lower altitudes going to be trying to sprout faster than coffees at higher altitudes? Are coffee germs less viable or more viable from plantations at lower altitudes than they are at higher altitudes, or from coffee farms at lower altitudes versus higher altitudes? All of these are things that I think that are worth exploring to see what might be the root cause. And then there are some ways, apparently they've experimented in treating coffee with this naturally occurring acid that causes the endosperm to just not start the process of breaking down the endosperm cap. So like, is that an option? Like if you have a farm at low altitude, could you potentially use this natural occurring acid to treat your coffee to prevent it from starting the germination process and then have a coffee that doesn't tip for your roasting partners? Ooh. I don't know. So these are all like super curious questions that I have no way of answering, but I have a lot of interest in hearing the answer from someone much smarter than myself.
So what do we do now? Like we've talked about a little bit about, the protocols to avoid this. And if you were talking to me as a roaster and saying, okay, well, here's some protocols that you should put in place right away to avoid tipping, but either before you even start roasting and, some protocols after roasting, what would you tell me? And is it, different instructions for people with, more air-focused roasters versus the conduction of drum roasters?
So I guess I would say that, first of all, almost all roasters are primarily convection. There's very few, if any, larger scale roasters that are primarily conduction based. Just because the effectiveness of heat transfer and the efficiency of heat transfer from convection is so much greater. So that being said, like the difference between a Loring and a traditional drum roaster in terms of how much convective heat energy they're transferring to the coffee seeds isn't as different as people think. They're quite a bit closer. Now the amount of airflow does change because every roaster kind of has its own number of cubic feet per minute that it's moving through the system. And then when you switch to fluidized bed, it's a power of scale difference. So for example, if you look at how much airflow per gram of coffee inside of a roasting machine, you take a look at a Loring versus an Ikawa, and the Ikawa is moving 6 times more air volume per gram of coffee in the chamber than a Loring is. So fluidized bed gets a little bit different. But for the most part, drum roasters are all kind of grouped together in terms of the fact that they're some conduction, but primarily convection. So I guess I'll make that statement first. In terms of best practices, then, some mental tweaks. Roasting slower doesn't necessarily mean roasting gentler, which is a total mind twist that happened for me when writing this paper. And the other thing is that your inlet air temperature is going to be your most important indicator of whether or not you're in the danger zone, so to say. Now, the downside is, even on the exact same roaster, if I move my thermocouple a few inches in any direction, I'm going to get a different temperature reading. So even on the same roasting machine, at the same point in the roast. So that's where it becomes difficult to give really solid advice to say like, oh, well, as long as you keep your inlet temperature below 750 degrees Fahrenheit, you're fine. Don't worry about it. It's not, unfortunately, that straightforward. And so there is going to be this discovery for people, even if you had the exact same machine that I have, Based on the altitude at which your coffee was grown, it could be different. And based on where you've actually located your thermocouple for inlet air temperature measurement, it could be different. So it'd be more just kind of like looking at your coffees and establishing baselines for where your danger zone for tipping is for your inlet air temperature reading, and then making adjustments for coffees that seem particularly susceptible.
So what, afterwards, we're constantly just kind of feeding the SOP here for how to deal with this based on the results we get from our coffees. So I suppose that there's a maybe a protocol to say, hey, if you haven't really thought about tipping that much in your roasting or taking it on as a project, you might go through all of your coffees and examine them, I suppose, and then you might have to be willing to tweak your recipes to try to avoid it, because you might find, some roasters might find that, gosh, like so many of our coffees have this tipping defect and we didn't even realize it until now. I mean, this could take a lot of work.
Yeah, and the protocol that I'm trying to implement on my own behalf is counting out 50 beans and looking at 50 beans per roast. Probably not for every roast, but just when I'm doing product development to see like, hey, did the batch that I just roast have a significant amount of tipping or not? And sometimes it can be alarming in quantity. There was one of the roasts that I did of a Galapagos coffee, which is what kind of spurred this whole project in the first place, was roasting a Galapagos coffee, which was higher density than the Kenyas that I've been roasting, but grown at 200 meters above sea level, which is really low, right? And so in 50 beans with one of the roasts, I noticed 50% tipping. I had 25 beans that were tipped out of 50. And let me tell you, that was a very noticeable amount of coffee beans tipped. Whereas in others, I think I had like 6 or 7, and that wasn't noticeable. And so, seeing where you're at currently, and if you're hitting 50%, I would suggest that you're probably noticing it in the flavor, whether or not you know it's connected to that or not. But then kind of looking at like, okay, well, where do we actually come out percentage-wise? And then when you retool your roasts to try and avoid it, you can count out 50 more beans and hopefully directly see a change in the percentage of tipped beans in your batch. So that would be the way to check to make sure that there's actually a difference being made objectively. And then, of course, following up with a cupping and tasting of those side by side to see if you can taste the difference.
Like one cupping of the beans that one all tipped and one all not tipped, right?
You could choose to set aside enough tipped beans to do a cupping of all tipped. That would be self-punishing, which is, I think people have enough self-punishment in their own life most of the time. But more just like on a production scale, because it's good to know what the tipping defect tastes like. So if you want to do that as an educational thing, like I've cupped cups of entirely Quakers before, and one time we saved up enough Quakers to brew an entire air pot of Quakers for our production team.
Oh, right.
That took some work. But the sad thing was the majority of them liked it, and that was just disconcerting. But that's a story for another day. However, what I would suggest is that learning about what it tastes like is important, but tasting it as your customers would taste it is probably most important. Mm-hmm. And so when you do your tasting, I would just taste it how it comes out in the cooling tray versus your new way of how it comes out in the cooling tray, and see if you notice a diminishment in smoky, ashen characteristics or dark roast characteristics. And if you do, then you're moving in the right direction. And then you can find the thresholds for your ability to taste. So you might find that, hey, 15 out of 20 for us, or 15 out of 50 for us is okay. And then you've got a threshold. But I think you have to pair it with that objective count, because we roasters get in our heads way too much. And I would even suggest doing it as a triangulation is probably important, just because the way that our brains work is, if you set 2 sets of coffee in front of me on the table, I'm going to assume that there's a difference between them. Yeah. And so I'm going to go into the tasting assuming that difference, and lo and behold, I'll probably find a difference because my brain's already convinced itself that there's a difference there. So triangulation is the best way to see if you've actually made a difference in the coffee or not. If you can pick out the one that has less tipping or more tipping, then you've made a substantial difference. If you can't, then you haven't made a big enough difference yet.
Nice. Got to fool yourself into making good decisions.
Yes, always.
Rob, this is fascinating. And like you said, there's so many more questions and probably more discoveries to make about this. And so I'm glad that you've kindled this conversation and came on the show to talk about it. So thank you. Where can people learn more about your work and your consulting and services?
Yeah, so if they go to host.coffee, there's no .com, it's just .coffee. That's my website, and it's got the tipping booklet for sale. There's also a blog post that I just recently made on roasting defects that has all of the objective and subjective defects listed out. And the objective ones have pictures, which is always fun. So those would be the places to look. And then I do post somewhat regularly on Instagram, but I use a third-party app. I'm not on social media, so if you try to message me there, you will get crickets. I just post and reply to comments on posts that I make.
Good to know. Well, again, Rob, wonderful to have you back on the show. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure to be here. Thank you, Chris.
As with anything related to roasting or the just craft of coffee, these are things that really are going to be experimental, that you apply to your context and create protocols that make sense for your coffee. These are great principles that Rob has outlined here to help us create a much better outcome when it comes to the avoidance, as much as we can help it, of tipping. And so a huge thank you to Rob for joining us on the show, for all of your work helping us pursue excellence in roasting. If you want to purchase this booklet, if you want to hire Rob, if you want to check out what he has to offer, go to his website, host.coffee. That's HOOS.coffee. That's where you can learn all about that. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback from me about today's episode, then please email me, chris@keystotheshop.com. If there are subjects or questions about roasting that you think should be covered on Rate of Rise that have not been covered in these now 18 episodes of the series, then please let me know. Again, reach out, chris@keystotheshop.com. And you can find all of our Rate of Rise series over at keystotheshop.com when you search episodes. Don't forget to subscribe to the show, everyone. That's a great way to help support the show. Share these episodes with your friends and on social media. So thanks very much for joining me, everybody, for this first Rate of Rise episode of the new year in 2023. I'm looking forward to more of these, and I hope, as always, that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.